in 2003, Brown's President Ruth Simmons appointed a steering committee on slavery and justice and asked us to investigate our university's historical relationship to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Also asked us to organize public programs that would encourage our students and, more optimistically, the nation as a whole to think in serious, sustained ways about the meaning of that history in the present, about the complex, I think I'm just almost reading from here, political, legal, moral, and historical questions that are raised by any effort in the present to confront legacies of historical injustice. The committee issued its report in October of 2006, and although it's available online as a free download, I've actually brought several printed copies, which are yours for the taking. What I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about both the report, the history that we explored, and some of, I think, what we learned in the process, not only about the past, but about the country that we live in today, and about the university of which all of us are a part. Start with a funny story, and in fact, this is the way we begin the report. The committee, there were 17 of us, and we met in the dean of the college's office in University Hall, chiefly because he was the only person at a table big enough to seat 17 people. And in the corner of the room was an antique grandfather clock, a beautiful clock that occasionally was on time and would toll the quarter hours. We'd been meeting for probably 6 months before one of us walked over and looked at the silver plaque on the cabinet of the clock, which identified the clock as the family clock of Admiral Isaac Hopkins. Now, Isaac Hopkins is a fairly well-known figure in Rhode Island history. He was the younger brother of Stephen Hopkins, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the first chancellor of Brown University, and also a Rhode Island governor. Isaac was also very distinguished. He was the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy, the United States Navy, during the Revolution. Admiral Street in Providence, if you remember from your time there, is named after him. His house is still there. There's an Isaac Hopkins Park in Providence. There's also an Isaac Hopkins Middle School. There's another part of Isaac Hopkins' life that's not registered in any of the public memorials nor in the plaque on the clock. In 1764, Isaac Hopkins was the master of a brigantine called the Sally, owned by the 4 Brown brothers, Nicholas, Joseph, John, and Moses, and dispatched on a slaving voyage to Africa. Nothing unusual about that, actually. Though we've contrived to forget it, Rhode Island was the epicenter of the North American portion of the transatlantic slave trade. I want to be a little careful here. North American ships constituted a fairly small portion of the total number of ships that carried slaves during the 340 years of the transatlantic trade. The number of slaves carried in North American ships was much smaller than those carried, say, in Portuguese ships, British ships, Spanish ships, French ships. But North Americans did carry slaves, and of those who did, about 2/3 of those ships came out of one colony and state, Rhode Island. In all, Rhode Islanders dispatched over 1,000 ships to West Africa in 100 years between 1707 and the banning of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and scores more voyages illegally thereafter. Hard to estimate totals, but at least 100,000 Africans were brought into New World slavery in Rhode Island ships. A few were brought to Rhode Island. The streets of Rhode Island, of Newport rather, which was the home of that slave trading fleet, the streets of Newport were literally paved by a duty on slave imports. But the vast majority who were carried in Rhode Island ships were not brought to Rhode Island, but to the sugar plantation colonies of the Caribbean: Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Cuba, Suriname. This was the basis of what contemporaries call the triangle trade. Sugar and molasses produced by Caribbean slaves was brought in Rhode Island ships to places like Newport, where it was distilled into rum. City of Newport in 1764, the year the university was founded, and also the year that the Sally sailed. The city of Newport had 22 rum distilleries. Some of that rum was then carried to West Africa, where it was exchanged for captives who were carried to the Caribbean to produce more sugar and molasses, to produce more rum, to produce more slaves. What was unusual about the voyage of the Sally, and we'll talk about it, was not that it happened, but that it proved so singularly disastrous and would set the Brown brothers, two of the Brown brothers in particular, on alternative courses. And their conflict would play out not only on our campus, but in the nation. But we'll talk about this, but before we do, I'd like to talk a little bit about the clock. And it seems to me that the clock poses a set of questions. Obviously, thinking of it sort of metaphorically, it's part of our heritage. It's part of our inheritance as members of a Brown community. It's one of the heirlooms, and if you've been around Brown, the campus is full of such things. Yet it embodies a history that we don't often talk about. And the question, I guess, that the committee, I hope, poses both for members of the Brown community and more broadly, is what happens if you confront that history as well? How do we, as members of the Brown community, as citizens of Rhode Island, as citizens of the United States, reconcile those aspects of our history that are beautiful and honorable with those that are horrifying and shameful? Those questions lead in a lot of very interesting directions. When the committee was appointed, I learned a couple things right off the bat. I mean, probably the best piece of evidence I can give you on why a committee like this is actually useful is the immediate assumption of people really across the political spectrum that the appointment of this committee meant that Brown was about to pay monetary reparations. It was never quite clear to who, but it was very instructive that when an institution said publicly, this is part of our history, this is a part of our history that we think we ought to be confronting and talking about, the kind of instant assumption of many people was that, oh, is Brown about to pay reparations? I remember, in fact, I had one experience, I had a sort of 15 minutes of fame when this happened, and I had one day where I was on two radio shows the same day. One, I was on the conservative talk radio program in Richmond, Virginia, the Drive Home show. They had me on basically because they wanted to make fun of me. And then I was on an XM show out of Detroit, a black nationalist show called The Power, and they basically wanted to congratulate me. And the callers on the one were basically denouncing this as an absurd exercise in political correctness. The callers in the other were basically, in some cases, literally telling me where I could send the check. And what struck me about that whole experience was I sort of had to say, actually, this isn't necessarily what we're talking about. What we are trying to do is basically say that these are a set of issues that people in our country don't even begin to know how to broach a conversation about, and we are going to try to use our history to facilitate that conversation. I also learned that you get emails. That the minute you're reported in the press as involved in something like this, you get emails. And some of this we expected. Look, the slavery reparations issue, it seems, certainly in retrospect, inevitable that when the university announced that it was involved with this investigation, that many people would immediately assume that this was a stalking horse for monetary reparations, and that many of those people would get agitated. There's probably not a single issue in American politics, in fact, that is more volatile or divisive than this one. Depending on how you ask the question, if you survey, and there's actually a very detailed survey done by historians or scholars, sociologists at Harvard and University of Chicago. If you survey African Americans on the question of monetary reparations, it actually depends how you ask the question. But between half and 2/3 will say that they believe that the United States today has some obligation to make some form of amends to people whose ancestors were enslaved. If you ask that question of white Americans, 96% say no. Now, I defy you to find me any issue in American politics that 96% of white people agree on. I mean, I think it's literally true that Osama bin Laden probably tracks higher than 4%, right? So clearly we're touching here on something very, very divisive that arouses great passion. And in that gulf, in some sense, it seems to me is the most powerful statement about why an exercise like this, conducted by a university, is in fact appropriate. We weren't being divisive. The issue was already deeply divisive. And what we were trying to do was encourage people to talk about it. The importance of that was driven home by an episode that happened prior to the university committee's appointment, and one that I think probably, Ruth Simmons is very interesting. She was very careful not to tell us what she was looking for, what she wanted. She didn't give us secret instructions. In fact, I wish she'd probably given us more. And every time I tried to weasel out of her a little bit about what are you looking for, she just said, you do your work. But I think one of the episodes that encouraged her to do this was an episode that took place on the campus in 2001. Some of you may remember it. What we on campus still call the Horowitz episode. In 2001, a conservative columnist named David Horowitz, and he's a provocateur. He used to, in his youth, be a radical Berkeley-based intellectual who was a left-wing provocateur. He then had a falling out with his allies in the Black Panther Party and became a right-wing provocateur. But basically, he's made a career out of, in recent years in particular, saying extremely provocative things, particularly in the context of college campuses, and watching the kinds of reactions that it elicits. He published an advertisement in 2001 called 10 Reasons Why Reparations for Slavery is a Bad Idea and Racist Too. And it's a piece of political provocation, with all due respect. Some of the ideas are actually quite sensible, some of the reasons I agree with quite heartily. A host of logistical and practical problems, simply determining who might be eligible for reparations, how one would calculate what a meaningful form of amends might be, and so forth. But a lot of his 10 reasons were, again, I think, deliberately inflammatory. That black people, in fact, should be grateful for enslavement because they were so much better off having not only been taken out of Africa, but having been exposed to the blessings of American democracy, that they should in fact be grateful to the white Christians who freed them, and so forth. Well, these were provocative sentiments, particularly provocative to throw into the tinderbox of a college campus. And that advertisement provoked controversy on a number of college campuses. Nowhere more than Brown, where a group of students in their wisdom constituted a group called, I think they called themselves Brown Concerned Students or some such thing, and demanded that the BDH, which had taken the ad and printed the ad, retract the ad. When the Brown Daily Herald editors refused to retract the ad and refused to disgorge, I think, the $75 that they had received in payment for it, the student protesters said, "We will stop your paper from circulating until you meet our demands." And the next day, when the BDH was distributed, it's an interesting question whether you can steal something that's free. But the next day, there were student protesters waiting at each of the distribution points of the Brown Daily Herald, and they took the entire press run of the paper. Now, of course, the editors of the BDH were about 10 steps ahead of them. They had cameramen at each of the distribution points, and they literally had the New York Times on the telephone. And the next day, you may remember this, Brown University was on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, the BBC did a story about this, as an example of an institution where students, when confronted with ideas that made them uncomfortable, basically resorted to smashing the presses. It was, I think, a very disgraceful experience on our campus. Now, Ruth Simmons was not the president of Brown at that time, but she had just been appointed president amidst much publicity, which I think may be part of the reason why David Horowitz sent it to us. She surely watched this, and she, in fact, discussed it at the very first convocation, the freshman convocation. Some of you who are Brown alums will remember the Van Wickle gates are open twice. They're open inward during your freshman year, and you process in. And then 4 years later, when you graduate, they open outward, and you process out. So at convocation, at the completion of that sort of processing in, the students sit there, her very first public speech at Brown, she talked about this episode. And she reminded people that universities depend on reasoned dialogue about even the most painful, awkward, and intractable ideas. And then told students, she said, if there are any of you here who expect this university to shield you from difficult ideas during your time here, we haven't closed the gates yet, you can still leave. She later said to some of the deans that what we should do was try to make this a teaching moment. And I think that's what she was really thinking, although again, I'm piecing this together, she's never said it to me directly. That we clearly at Brown and in our country, we're not doing a very good job teaching students how to engage in reasoned discourse about controversial ideas, and that maybe we could do better, and maybe we could use the experience of our own institution to do so. That's the background to the committee. And I'm going to try to resist the temptation to speak for my usual 50 minutes. That's one of the downsides of being a professor, is you get programmed to speak in 50-minute intervals, as my wife reminds me frequently. I'll try to be briefer, but what I want to do is just, the fruits of our investigation are on a website as well as the final report that's here, and I just want to show you a little bit about sort of some of the stuff that we turned up, some of the stuff that we tried to do, and then invite your thoughts and your comments and your reflections. So this is actually the committee's website. The URL, if you want to find it, is actually easier than that. That's what it routes you to. It's just brown.edu/slaveryjustice, one word. And it will bring you to this website. And you can navigate your way around the website. So if you click here, it will download the report as a PDF. The photographs are actually beautiful and in color. So if you have a color printer, print it. It's 100 pages long, so print it on somebody else's printer. The copies I brought here are, I'm afraid, in black and white. But you can read the report. It actually is, I think, a very lively and provocative read. It's not a dry piece of academic writing at all. About a third of it is dedicated to history. A third of it surveys the experience of retrospective justice in other societies. So we had speakers, and we write about everything from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission to Japanese American internment to issues involving Australian Aborigines, just looking all over the world at the experience of societies and institutions that have tried to confront legacies of historic injustice. What might we learn from them? If we want to have a sensible, thoughtful conversation, how can we draw on the experience of others to do so? And the last third looks specifically at the history of the reparations debate in the United States. And I dare say, if you're only going to read one thing about that debate, that history, where that issue has come from, the state of it now, and where it might go in the future, I think this is probably the single best thing that you can read. But in addition to that, there's a lot of other stuff over here in sort of supplementary materials, and I'm just going to sort of navigate you through some of these. One of the things you can do, that should now, there we go, is you go to our calendar of events, and you can actually see all of the events that we sponsored over a course of 2.5 years of public programs, including 2 international conferences that we ran, one co-sponsored with Yale's Gilder Lehrman Institute. We heard from over 100 distinguished scholars on, again, everything from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the history and mythology of the Underground Railroad, to the unfinished history of the Mississippi Freedom Movement, restitution and reconciliation in international perspective. In fact, this is an extraordinary one right here at the very end. Our final event, we were quite careful, or this was very important to us, was to invite a slavery survivor. Slave trade has not ended. You can win a bet on this. In what year were the largest number of slaves transported across a national boundary? The answer is 2006, superseding 2005, which superseded 2004. Depending on estimates, which estimate you use, between 800,000 and 3 to 4 million people are trafficked every year in the world today to over 80 countries, including this one. The largest number being women and children, the largest single component being the sex trade. We spoke to we were visited by Beatrice Fernando, a Sri Lankan author and activist, who spoke about her own experience as a slave. What you can actually do then with most of these where they're highlighted in red is you can actually click and you can stream them. We didn't put them all there, but we tried to choose about 5 minutes that distilled what that particular speaker had tried to say. So this is actually, I mean, there's some really, really extraordinary stuff on this. So I encourage you to surf it. We published a curriculum in conjunction with the Choices program, which is a curricular development unit at the Watson Institute at Brown. This curriculum called A Forgotten History, the Slave Trade and Slavery in New England. And we were able to distribute copies of that curriculum for free to every high school history and social studies classroom in the state. In fact, this is a true story. Well, I have a couple of kids in high school. One of them was up really late recently on a Sunday night, and we had our normal conversation, which is, why are you doing your homework now? And he said, I have to write an answer to this stupid prompt. And I said, what's a prompt? And he said, well, it's a question they ask you, and you have to then come up with your own opinion about it. I said, what's the prompt? And I realized that it was a prompt that I had, in fact, written, because he was using this, and he was really unhappy with me when I told him that. Part of what we did in the interest of transparency was, and this was also the spirit in which we put the streaming of the video up there as well. This isn't a star chamber. We want you to come along with us. And we wanted to make available for people to see everything that we found. And you can draw your own conclusions as you wish. So all of the historical documents that we uncovered, some in the Rhode Island Historical Society, other local archives, most of them on our campus, either in the archives, the Brown archives in the John Hay Library, or in the Brown family papers in the John Carter Brown Library on the main green. Those documents that were relevant we actually digitized, and you can scan them. Most of them have been transcribed, so you can see them. We've actually built in some cases, teaching materials to use with them and so forth. It's really, I think, well, they're stunning. Right now, so you can just browse them in a variety of ways. I've clicked Browse All, and what happens, you'll see them all. So you can actually just go through these. You get little introductions to each of the documents, and then you can click them, and you can see them. So these are papers. Here, for example, is a very interesting correspondence in 1763 between Carter Braxton, a Virginian, later a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and the Brown family, contemplating sending a voyage. This is, I think, what prompted them in 1764 to send the Sally. I won't click to see the document, but if you look at them, Gold Coast slaves are esteemed most valuable and sell best, Braxton wrote, adding the prices of Negroes keep up amazingly. I'll tell you the one that I thought was really coolest, if I can find it quickly. I don't know if I'll be able to find it or not. But one of the things that was really mind-blowing, I think, to me and to a number of us, was to realize that we weren't the first people on our campus asking these questions. That during the era of the transatlantic slave trade and during the years in the run-up to the Civil War, there was intense debate on our campus about slave trading, slavery itself, and what responsibilities, if any, members of the Brown community bore in light of it. The prevalence of the slave trade in Rhode Island's economic life in the 18th century meant inevitably that many of the founders and early benefactors of Brown were people who had participated in and drawn at least part of their wealth from slave trading and ancillary industries. We were able to identify by name 30 Brown trustees, members of the Brown Corporation, either trustees or fellows, who had either owned or captained slave ships. On the other hand, Brown would also become a seedbed of the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. And in fact, the first prosecutions for illegal slave trading brought in American history were brought by members of Brown's Board of Trustees against other members of Brown's Board of Trustees. It was then the College of Rhode Island. But the one that struck me most forcibly, so we found a lot of this stuff. We found student debates, debating societies, stuff where this was being discussed in classrooms. one brown student who went to work for the American Anti-Slavery Society, who was arrested in Nashville for distributing abolitionist literature and publicly whipped. But the single document that most amazed me, and it's here, you can click it, was a commencement address by James Talmadge. James Talmadge, some of you who are historians will recognize, he was a congressman during the Missouri Compromise, an anti-slavery congressman. It was Talmadge who drew a line west from the southern border of Missouri towards the Pacific and said, slavery will never again go above this line. And it was the attempt of Southerners to do away with that agreement that precipitated the Civil War. Actually, I should be very careful speaking in the state of Georgia about my casual interpretation of why the Civil War came about. But James Talmadge was a very influential person. But before he was a congressman, he was a Brown student. And in 1795, he delivered the commencement address. And we found the commencement address in the Brown archives in his hand. And with many of the nation's premier slave traders sitting in the audience, he said, I take as my subject today a violation of the rights of man, being the transatlantic slave trade. And he works through systematically each of the reasons that was adduced by supporters of the trade by way of justification, including the idea, as he says, that a person of dark complexion is somehow inferior to a person more fair. An idea, he says, if taken to its logical conclusion, which would make us all subject to some puny white sovereign. But at the conclusion of his address, having demolished and derided the various pro-slavery arguments, he says, you know, the fact that people on our campus in this day and age are making arguments like that is a matter for future generations to investigate. That struck me very powerfully. In any event, you can browse through some of these things. What we also did was we decided to create a virtual voyage of a slave ship. I don't think that there's anything quite like this else around at this point. The Sally, the ship that was sent by the four Brown brothers in 1764, the year of the university's founding. In the John Carter Brown Library, virtually every document pertaining to that voyage is stored there. The Browns were not, by the standards of Rhode Island, major participants in the transatlantic slave trade. The largest Rhode Island slave trading family, the DeWolfs of Bristol, were engaged in at least 80 slave trading voyages. The Browns, three of the brothers were involved in two. A fourth one, John, was engaged in, I think, a total of 6. But the Sally is one of the best documented voyages because the Browns kept everything. In the archives of the John Carter Brown Library on campus, there are between 300,000 and 400,000 documents from the Brown family enterprises. It is literally the case, if you brought a cup of sugar from a Brown family enterprise in 1750, I can tell you your name, the date, and what you paid for it. So we were able to reconstruct, it's probably not the most extensively documented slave trading voyage, but it surely would be close. And we were able to reconstruct, using documents, an entire voyage. So if a baker loaded loaves of bread on the ship the day before it departed, and he did, we can tell you who he was and what he was paid. We can tell you exactly what was on the ship, how many leg shackles, how many chains, how many gallons of rum, 17,274 gallons of rum, and so forth. Each transaction on the West African coast, up to the bills of sale for survivors of the journey when they were sold in Antigua. And so we introduced this site, and we'll be developing it much more extensively. This is in some sense just kind of the bare bones of it. It has maps, timelines, and so forth here. And you can basically navigate through this and have a kind of virtual voyage of a slave ship. So one of the things is that if you navigate through history, it's a short overview of the voyage, and then a series, we've broken the voyage up into a series of discrete sections. And with each of these, there's a short essay about each of these aspects of the voyage, and then embedded in those short essays are the documents that you can click to. So, for example, I've just pulled a few out here. Assembling a crew. So putting together a voyage of a slave ship, a crew for a slave voyage, and here you have it. This is in articles. This is, in fact, somebody who was in the Merchant Marines told me that it looks almost like this still when you sign on to a ship. But when sailors signed onto a ship, they literally signed, you can see in the column here. The articles specified their office and their wage, as well as the date they were discharged and what they were paid. So you can see, for example, Esek Hopkins, master, 50 pounds a month, plus a privilege. Slave ship captains and the officers of a slave ship received a commission. Typically, it was 4 on 104. Just for every 104 bodies you delivered alive, you were able to sell 4 on your own account. Hopkins is actually offered a more liberal privilege, 10 barrels of rum on the outboard journey and 10 slaves on the return. One of the things I found quite interesting, Edward Abbey, Negro boy, 30 pounds. Now, whether he's the cabin boy, I don't know. But there was an African or African-American who was in the crew. And in fact, once you decode this down here, it's clear that his 30 pounds per month is being paid to the account of Esek Hopkins. So he was Esek Hopkins' slave. This is a transaction. This is just a page from the logbook. And you can actually see a slave ship trading. I'm conscious of the fact that Professor David Eltis is here, who's a professor at Emory who knows more about the slave trade than anyone. So I am aware of the fact that if I get anything wrong, I'll hear about it. But this particular ship, I mean, in general, diseases like malaria, yellow fever, had not yet been identified as distinctive maladies, nor had people yet understood that mosquitoes were their vector. But slave traders knew that the longer you were on the West African coast, the more apt you were to die, particularly if you were there during the rainy season. So what you would try to do is you would try to get on and off the coast as quickly as possible. And I think routinely that might take 2.5, 3 months. You couldn't simply drive up and load up purchase 200 slaves, right? Sometimes a ship would settle in a particular place at a fortress or upriver and wait for a trickle of slaves to come down. Sometimes they would coast, work their way along a series of coastline, picking up allotments where they could. But in general, you tried to get on and off the coast as quickly as you could. Unfortunately for the Sally, in 1764, with the end of the 7 Years' War with France, there was a backlog of demand for slaves in the Americas, and many other people had the same idea as the Browns. 24 ships cleared that fall from Rhode Island alone. And by the time Hopkins gets to the West African coast, it is awash in slave ships and in rum. Trade is very dull. The people who are in the dominant position are those who are selling slaves rather than those who are seeking them. It takes him ultimately almost 10 months to fill his cargo. So there are Africans who are loaded in the ship for 9 months before it has even left the coast. He's actually been trying very hard to piece together exactly where he is. I'm persuaded he puts in at James Fort on the Gambia River, the main British slave trading factory. But then he goes down into Portuguese territory in what's now Guinea-Bissau and sits at the mouth of the Grand River and waits for people to come to him. You can actually see, let's just look at one transaction here, number 107. There were so many different currencies being used on the coast that a lot of transactions were denominated in bars, which was a kind of equivalency. A bar was literally an iron bar, which was a very useful trade good. Could be made into weapons, could be made into pots, could do a lot of different things with it. A large bar was 2. And so slaves would be valued in bars, and the commodities that were exchanged for them would also be calculated in that equivalency. So here you can see 3 kegs and 11 flasks of rum, 41 bars. A keg was about 110 gallons. 12 yards of cloth, 3 English guns and 3 flasks of powder, 16 bars, 3 large and 3 small iron bars, 9, and so forth, totaling 96 bars for a boy slave. And this is a page that's also quite arresting for the thing at the bottom. A Begua woman slave hanged herself between decks, number 2, in the debit column. By the time the ship finally left the West African coast, about 2 months after this, in August of 1765, 19 of the captives that Hopkins had purchased had died. A 20th woman, described in the log as almost dead, was left behind. This is the next to last page. This is of the return voyage. The ship sailed on August 20th. On August 21st, 1 girl slave died, 1 boy slave died. A week out, slaves rose on us, was obliged, fire on them, and destroyed 8, and several more wounded badly. 1 thigh and 1 ribs broke, 25 to 32. Thereafter, death became an almost daily visitor on the ship. The bodies were carefully accounted and then would have been tossed into the sea. In a letter to the Browns, Hopkins explained that the slaves had become so dispirited after the failed insurrection that some killed themselves, some starved, some sickened and died. But the speed at which they're dying, there's no evidence of smallpox, but the speed at which they're dying, and ultimately there's a second page that goes on, numbered to 109. The speed at which they're dying suggests the operation of some disease, most likely, I think, amoebic dysentery, which would be a waterborne pathogen transmitted through human feces that would taint water supplies, producing violent diarrhea and eventually death through dehydration. In all, Hopkins was able to sell about 60 of the 196 Africans that he had purchased on the West African coast. A prime slave in Antigua, the West Indian island of Antigua, where the Sally sold its cargo, in Antigua in 1765 was worth at least 50 pounds. And here you can actually see some people being purchased for as little as 4 or 6 pounds, which I think gives you some sense of their physical condition. There was, in fact, this seems an odd usage, it was almost a kind of junk bond market. There were people who would specialize in purchasing what were called refuse slaves. Just like a junk bond, something that you're likely to lose your investment, but you can buy a lot of it much more cheaply. And that if you bought 10 slaves for the price of 1 and were able to nurse a couple of them back to health, you could then sell them at a profit. This interests me quite a lot. In the entire logbook, the only usages that are used, people are never identified as woman slave, man slave, boy slave, girl slave. Here it says woman and child. It's the only time the word child is used, and I can only imagine that it's an infant being sold with its mother. So possible, certainly wouldn't be unprecedented, that it was a child who would have been born on the ship. The Browns lost their shirts on this voyage. It was the second time the brothers had tried the transatlantic slave trade, and the second time they'd lost their shirt. In fact, 5 years before, in 1759, they'd sent another ship, the Wheel of Fortune, that got taken by a French privateer. After this, they basically decided to get out of the business. They didn't stop outfitting other slave ships, selling rum and so forth. But they basically had decided that this aspect of the mercantile business was simply too risky, except for one of the brothers. John, the second oldest, the most robustious in a whole variety of ways, believed that there was still money to be made in the trade. He sent another ship in 1769, and in fact, in 1770, the brothers split their shipping interests, in part, I think, because of John's insistence on continuing in the slave trade. It's a letter that Moses wrote to the other brothers saying, anyone who is willing to risk the entire on the last roll of the dice will sooner or later lose it all, and that's what he thought of as his brother. There's no evidence, or very little evidence, that they withdrew from the trade out of any moral qualms. But one of the brothers, Moses, would soon experience moral qualms. In 1773, Moses Brown had a conversion experience brought about by the death of his wife, Anna. He converted to Quakerism, he manumitted his slaves, and he very quickly emerged as, I think probably it's safe to say this, the leading, or certainly one of the leading advocates of abolishing the slave trade in the United States. He authored Rhode Island's Gradual Abolition Act, a 1787 act passed in Rhode Island that made it illegal for Rhode Islanders to participate in the slave trade, an act that was completely ignored by Rhode Islanders. He lobbied for the passage of federal legislation in 1793 and 1800, which made it illegal for American ships to carry slaves to foreign ports, a law which was also completely ignored nowhere more flagrantly than Rhode Island. In fact, the first person prosecuted in federal district court for violation of the 1793 law was John Brown, in a prosecution brought at the behest of his brother Moses. Initially, the dispute between the brothers took place in private letters, and we have a bunch of these letters. We discuss them in the report. This is just one. Moses in 1786 gets wind of the fact that John's sending another slave ship to Africa. And he writes him, and he begs him not to do it. And this is, in fact, John's reply. He tells John to search his conscience, and John assures him that he has, and that he's got no qualms. Let me find the spot. It's right here. I have no doubt of your sincerity in your exertions to discourage the slave trade, and did I consider it as you do, I would by no means be concerned in it. But from the best information I can get, and that has been from great numbers, the slaves are positively better off that is brought from the coast than those who are left behind. He goes on to say later, this trade has been permitted by the supreme governor of all things from time immemorial. And whenever I am convinced, as you are, that it is wrong in the sight of God, I will immediately desist. But while it is allowed by the supreme governor, who am I to say no? Well, this is a small part of what we discovered and what we talked about. I hope it has made the case, whoops, can somebody turn on some lights? That it persuades you that this was a worthwhile exercise. I have no doubt that some of you, many people in the Brown community, when they first heard that this committee had been appointed, wondered just what it was we thought we were doing. I hope now that you have a better sense of what that was. In closing, I just want to read you one thing, and this was another one of those moments where you feel someone speaking to you across time. Part of what we tried to reiterate again and again when people asked us why we were doing this was simply to say, Brown is a university. This is what universities do. Universities profess to be truth-seeking. They profess to be conservators of humanity's past. They profess to cherish their own pasts, honoring their forebears and plaques and memorials and portraits. I mean, if you walk around the Brown campus, there's a lot of pictures of dead people on the wall, right? As there are here. I mean, what's that about? What it reflects is our sense that we are members of a community that exists across time, and that we are enriched by the legacy that we inherit from those who came before, and that we will pass along that legacy further enriched to those who come after. If an institution professing those kinds of values isn't in a position to look squarely at its own history, it's hard to imagine what institution or society is. In any event, the document I wanted to close with was one where, again, as I say, you felt like someone was speaking to you across the ages. Probably the most eloquent statement of that notion of what a university is comes from one of Brown's own presidents, one of Ruth Simmons' predecessors, Reverend William Faunce. And of course, all of you from the Brown campus know walking through Faunce Hall and Faunce Arch. In a 1914 sermon commemorating the university's sesquicentennial, Faunce asked, "Are we wrong? Are we merely superstitious if we hold that these early leaders passing through our American colleges have left a portion of themselves behind? It is not only ivy that clings to ancient walls, it is memories, echoes, inspirations. The very stones cry out a summons." He continued, "Have we entered so new a world that we have no further connection with the generation in which these colleges were born? To think so would be to show ourselves without the sense of either historic continuity or moral obligation. It is in the spirit of historic continuity and moral obligation that we at Brown and of Brown have done what we've done." Thank you.